The Misfits.
Hey everybody, we're back. Bluebeard's back, and we're going to do this a little bit different than normal when Bluebeard is on, because typically when Bluebeard is on, we are dealing with stuff where I'm asking him a bunch of questions and we're just letting Joe be Joe. Today though, we are going to do something that Joe asked to do, which isn't the first time that he's invited himself on to handle a topic, but he wanted to do this topic specifically because of the year it is, and we are actually going to do it a little bit earlier on in the year than we initially planned, but things have presented themselves in a way that we need to just do it now. So, Joe, you want to introduce what we're actually talking about?
So, in the year of our good Lord 2024, when everything is at a fever pitch as far as politics and the social discourse around all of that, we are talking about the world of voting and what exactly that looks like. You know, with all of the conversations that we have about from the Christian perspective, how to view people and all of that kind of stuff. How do Christians engage with this whole topic of voting?
Yeah. How do we do it? So, this isn't the first time necessarily that we've addressed this, both in terms of we did this a little bit actually when I was on Buddy Walk last summer, when we were talking some of the different things in the Book of Esther. We've done this multiple times in different settings throughout the past 4 seasons of Misfits, and that's what the Murica pack on YouTube is one where you'll find all of them, and then you can also find the listing and everything like that. But we haven't addressed it directly, and it's part of the reason we hadn't was because there was no reason to address it directly, because it was part of a much bigger thing anyway. This year, and specifically now even I would say this month, we have seen some shifts that are now at a point where, well, maybe we do need to actually address this directly anyway. So the shifts that we're talking about, there's a couple of things that we're dealing with, and we're going to try to hit all of them as we go through. One of the things we need to address is the whole idea of voting, what it is and why it matters in terms of Christianity. We then need to move into more specifically on the domestic side, some of the different theories that we've heard, at least. We'll just call them theories for now. We'll call them heresy later. Theories that we've heard regarding the voting in terms of you must vote Republican, or you must vote Democrat, or you must vote this way, or you must vote this on a certain issue, all these different things. And then we're going to then address it more specifically in terms of what to do when suddenly all of the theories and heresies that you've had on this matter suddenly don't matter, because the people that you were trusting in have all completely turned out to be completely false and lying to you and being straight up politicians. Imagine that. I will do my best in some circumstances when we get through this to not say I told you so, but some of this is stuff I've been saying for a decade and nobody was paying attention. So we're going to deal with this the best way we can, and hopefully the most charitable way we can, but it's also early, so you never know what's going to come out with Joe and I. So Joe, I'm gonna let you actually start this, and then I'll keep going and build off. What is it? What's the deal with voting? First of all, what are we actually talking about when we talk about the act of voting? What's the big deal? Why does it actually matter here?
So first and foremost, hashtag road to the logo. I'm just saying it's going to happen. Voting is something that I didn't necessarily take seriously at first. I didn't think it was being as swayed towards anti-America, anti-politics, all of that kind of stuff. I just didn't see a point. But I realized, okay, we are flesh and blood, which means we live in a corporeal world, which means we need to live here, and part of that is engaging with the world around us and throwing our voice into the mix when it comes to policies or procedures or people or representatives or different things like that. And so I then set out to try and wrap my mind around what that looks like while still carrying forward the whole thing of image bearers and how we view these different policies in light of Matthew 5-7, and trying to hold the ethics that I hold near and dear and bring those with me into the voting space. And one of the things that I quickly realized that I think need be talked about more often is the fundamental misunderstanding on both sides about what it means to have a Christian policy or a Christian representative, or for it to be the good Christian thing to vote for one specific policy over another. Namely because, man, if you have somebody talented in being able to give a compelling argument, and you look at most any of these policies and things like that, you could have somebody spin a wonderful story about how their side of the decision is the good Christian side to that. And there's so many different topics within that pivot around our walk with Christ, that if we are going to try and be charitable about this, if we are going to try and come alongside our brothers and sisters and say, okay, voting is a thing, the dumpster fire of American politics is a thing, and we've got to navigate all of this as a Christian, well, then maybe let's demystify what it looks like to have the right perspective around voting as a whole. Because I think if we are able to put the pegs down on the conceptual, then there's a lot of more individualized topics that will become a lot easier to navigate if you have a compass of sorts.
And that's where, the first thing that we need to deal with is this whole idea of voting or not voting, because this is part of the problem, is that we hear people that will agree 100% with what Joe said and come to the conclusion, well, that means I shouldn't vote. We have some people that hear what Joe said, agree with it completely, and say, well, that's the reason why we have to vote, and we have to vote this specific way.
Right.
I'm going to start with actually the thing that people are going to be shocked about more than anything else in this episode, probably, is we can actually give a biblical defense for why voting as a American believer is actually part of something that we are actually called to do. What we see throughout the book of Acts is Paul doing his missionary thing. That's the basic summary. If we want to demystify a book, there's the basic summary of Acts, is Paul goes and does his missionary thing. But towards the end, what happens is that Paul gets arrested over and over and over, which is part of the missionary thing he does. But eventually he gets arrested somewhat intentionally because his goal is to get to Rome. Yeah. And what better way to get to Rome than to be escorted there by the Roman military as a prisoner? So, as this is going on, people are upset with him. They're getting him arrested, and there's a very specific thing that happens in Acts 22. is that when the guard asked Paul, what gives you the right to do this? Paul says, well, I'm a citizen. When he says, how did you get this? Paul says, I was born a citizen. I know my rights. I'm going to use them. This is a very small passage of scripture that is, I find it ironic that it's not used more by the CNN Cold War theology crowd, but it's somewhat ignored in a lot of ways, because this isn't this in a good way. It's ignored because that's not the point of Acts 22. The point of Acts 22 is the message that Paul actually delivered that got him in the situation. But it is a very interesting thing to see is that the same guy that wrote in multiple places, I was the ultimate Jew.
Yeah.
The same guy that writes, follow me as I imitate Christ. The same guy that has said he considers everything else that he has ever accomplished or done as trash and rubbish is also one of the only people we see in scripture that will gladly identify himself as a citizen of Rome when needed.
Right.
So before we even deal with what this means for us, why do you think that is, Joe, that's not actually used more than it? In a good way, it's not used more. But why do you think people don't go to that verse more often when we have these kind of discussions?
Big part of it is the fact that the book of Acts is largely overshadowed by the gospel accounts. And thus there's a lot of, oh, this is how they built the early church. And this is where Saul becomes Paul. And within the first half of the book is where most of the arguments lie. For those of you that don't know, over on Buddy Walk with Jesus, we're in the midst of the Acts project. We've been there for about 6 months already, and so many. I made the joke at the very beginning of the Acts project that once we come out of this, people are going to think that I'm either raging Pentecostal or raging Catholic, one of the two, because of the way that I addressed the whole Holy Spirit thing, the whole speaking in tongues thing, all of that kind of stuff. And that is generally where a lot of those arguments tend to live and die, is in that part. Or what does it mean for Jewish folks in light of all of this? Or what does it mean about eschatology in light of all of this? Because it's the first real time that we see in scripture where the world is pivoting. The New Testament, like, yes, in our Bibles, the New Testament starts with the gospel accounts, but they still are very much in flavor of the Old Testament. Acts is really the first one that's in that new flavor of the New Testament. And so I'm not sure folks get that far down the road in terms of critically thinking through the book to be able to dissect out what's happening. Also, it requires a through line of understanding that it's not so much about trying to find what you're doing, is not so much about trying to find how can I retrofit America into the Bible, as it is saying, okay, so if the entirety of the biblical canon is one continuous narrative that ultimately leads to Jesus, and we've said time and time and time again, I've been here giving you guys the argument before. I've been in other places talking about the empty tomb and the plausibility of the empty tomb and the legitimacy of the fact that Jesus walked the earth. And so you put all of those pieces together, and then you realize, okay, we are still on that same timeline. What we are looking at is part history with Paul and with getting arrested and all of that sort of stuff. So what you're doing is looking at the runway that has led us to 2024, rather than trying to put America into the Bible. And that isn't the right part of town for folks that want to read the scriptures in a certain kind of way.
And that's the bigger piece. That second piece is the bigger piece of why it's not used. Because for a lot of people, the first part is exactly what you were talking about. Acts is a complete mood shift in a lot of ways. We go from Jesus walking the earth and teaching and rabbinical relationships and discipleship and all these things to now we've got people going and selling their stuff, living together, getting killed together, running away, and then some dude comes in and starts this whole missionary thing.
Yeah.
It's a completely different story mode all the way around. But for those that are in the teaching roles that are pushing a lot of these things, they've gotten through Acts and they know the story.
Mm-hmm.
But they still don't use it largely because if you actually look at Acts 22 and see the citizenship and see how Paul uses it, we already are at a point where the idea of retrofitting or any type of this is an American concept or a democracy concept goes out the window.
Right.
Because what we actually see Paul do is that he uses his citizenship in a way that is beneficial to the kingdom and not to himself.
Exactly.
Everything about how he goes about it is one in where he does not object to being arrested. But he knows his rights as a citizen to be able to say, you're not going to be able to kill me this way.
Right.
I get to go before the emperor.
Right.
And when he's questioned about it, he also makes the point to show that he has always been a citizen. He was never not a citizen of Rome, to push the fact that I know what is going on here. But then the very next chapter, when he is released, pending further investigation, he immediately goes right back to what he was doing, to where he no longer is identifying himself as a Roman citizen anymore. He is now back to identifying himself as once a member of the Pharisees that is now going back to his people, because we now see him go to the Sanhedrin to make an argument there.
Right.
That is not what we see in terms of why people are saying citizenship matters and so we should vote. Now, the other piece to the why we should vote is something that you brought up when you first were kind of defining it. And this gets into more of the discussion of, well, can you vote one way and still be a Christian, or vote another way and not be a Christian?
Right.
Is the fact that part of what we in America at least are dealing with when we get to voting is that most of the time what we at least claim we are voting for is policy.
Yeah.
Policy is different than voting for a person in basic theory, even though we're going to get to why that's not normally how it ends up playing out here in a little bit. So I'm going to actually start with you, Joe, before I get into it. When we talk about this idea of a Christian responsibility for voting, I think both of us would agree, and anybody that's listened to us do any of this stuff, is that both of us are going to say very clearly that the one place that you can make an argument that voting is a Christian duty would be in terms of policy. Where should we start in terms of talking about this whole thing, in terms of what we mean by policy, first of all? And then what is it that you specifically look for in terms of if we are going to say, Christians, this is where we are supposed to, what we're supposed to be doing here?
So first and foremost, the whole thing about policy is basically about having a say in the procedures that are at play in the world around us. That can be at a local level, that can be at a state level, that can be at a national level. There was something that you said when you were talking about the whole idea. There was something that you said when you were talking about the whole idea of Pauline the Pauline section of Acts and heading into the epistles and heading into like what Paul's story is and all of that. When he leverages his citizenship, it's not out of a place of supremacy. It's out of a place of this is how I get into the room to be able to do what I need to do. It's just leveraging a tool. And when we think about policy, we need to avoid the trap of voting out of a place or looking at it from a place of superiority and saying this side is correct, that side is correct. Because please understand, guys, if ever, like if I had to struggle to get the words out to give myself a label as far as this world goes, I am as independent as you could possibly conceive of. Like that so I'm not I will gladly take aim at left, right, and center as far as looking at this through the lens of superiority. So this is not about the right. It's not about specifically the left. We're talking everybody here. So the first thing that needs to go when approaching the conversation is that air of superiority, that we need to save the godless heathens by the way in which we vote, and thinking that that will be the thing that will save people. Because here's the weird thing about people and policies and perspectives. Two people can look at the same procedure and put the pin in a different spot to call, oh, okay, so this is good Christian policy. Well, what about this after effect of the policy that affects all of these other people adversely? Does it still make it a Christian policy? And that's where it needs to boil down to love God, love others, because you can still do that and take that ethic with you when engaging with all of the maelstrom of different aspects of this. So before you even look at what the policy is, check your heart posture with God, and pray before walking into the situation. Then from that point, as you've heard us say dozens of times at this point, extrapolate out the thought process. If you read something, think it through. Think 4, 5, 6 steps down the line. What does it mean if this policy becomes effective? Or what does it mean if this policy is not effective? How does it affect different people, not just at the core center, but as a ripple effect beyond that point? Because then if you can orient yourself and you can focus on the core tenets of what it means to be kingdom citizens, you've already taken the ball farther down the field than if you just go forward and say, I am a Christian, which means I have to vote conservatively. I am a Christian, that means I have to vote liberally. Or I am a Christian, I have to back this specific flavor of policy or politic or something along those lines, and can at least give you a rubric to say, okay, a lot of this other stuff, a lot of the specifics of the situation cannot be properly addressed in a hour-ish long podcast episode. But at least if you drive past the surface layer into the heart posture that you're approaching, because again, we can take a lot of times Paul gets misquoted, so whatever, let's play, let's party, guys. We want to pull Paul into this conversation. Sure, awesome, let's pull Paul into the conversation. You're talking about one of the guys that was so educated and so dialed in and so practiced and knew the laws and knew all of his rights as a Roman citizen and knew all of these different things. And still, before anything else, before he engaged in political conversations at all, we were already hearing him talking about Christ and him crucified, talking about love God, love others. That's literally that's part of why for a lot of people, and I think spoilers ahead for season 5 of Buddy Walk. You got after you hang out in Acts, you got to go to Rome. You got to go to Rome and go to Romans to see, okay, what does it look like when Paul is bringing about a teaching for a new context to love God and love others?
And that's where we're going to actually start walking through a little bit, is this idea of what does that actually mean to love God, love others in terms of politics in general, but especially when we're talking about our role as a church in the US where voting is something that we do.
Yeah.
And the first thing that I think I'm going to push past a little bit what you had already identified as far as the love God, love others, into how far Paul actually takes it. Because the idea of love God, love others in terms of policy is very easy to get twisted. Because loving God, loving others means that I want them to have everything I have, and so that means that I need to be in the spot to be able to help them. Or it's well, if this sort of thing doesn't look like the way that I love God, then it's not loving God, so we must vote against it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to push a little bit further through the lens of Paul into what Paul's phrase that he uses to identify what Jesus taught with loving God and loving others, especially when you look at in the context of Matthew 5 and Matthew 6 and Matthew 7 and Luke 4 and Luke 6, is what we see in Philippians chapter 2 of considering others and considering others' interests as more important than our own.
So, yes, that is what it looks like to love others sacrificially. That is the tenet that Jesus taught, and that's why it blows my mind how often I see Paul and Jesus juxtaposed to one another, because he taught just to a different group of people all of the same things that Jesus taught. Here's the thing, though. I really do fundamentally believe that in order to help folks wrap our minds around all of that, I think that pin of putting parameters on loving God and loving others needs to be a piece that sets the table. And while I think you can read Paul and understand the value that he puts on that and where he puts it, and you can hear the shadows of Jesus, you can hear the influence of Jesus and what he taught. I think in order to really wrap your mind around that, you've got to turn it back. You've got to go back to the gospel accounts. You've got to go back to what does it mean to love, because then the next question for somebody who wants to interrogate what Paul, if you don't have that rubric in place, that ethic in place, and you go to Paul and what he did, well, then you can just start interrogating, who is my neighbor? What is their best? What does it mean for them to have their best? And so that's why I think we've proven as a people, that this is not a matter of specifics. We do not struggle in the specifics, because I don't think that we allow ourselves to even get far enough in the muck and mire to be affected by specific thought or specific execution of these concepts. It's at a conceptual level where we're even introducing the theme of love God, love others, that the train already falls directly off the tracks, that it is already not picked up. And so I'm not sure, like, yes, that is a section where that is taught, but at where do we point folks to be able to understand what it is that they're reading that Paul is saying past an assumptive level? Because we're talking about Christians, right? And I think any one of us that are Christians, we're going to say, "Do you read your Bible?" And all of us are going to jump up and say, "Yes." Your mileage may vary on the veracity of that statement, but that's a horse of a different color. But you to read it, to know the words, and to understand the ethic of living as a fully functioning citizen of the kingdom of God are two vastly different things. So I think if we are going to step into, and I do want to say this because it hasn't been said yet, and so for those of you, I know most of you guys, this is a very, very political part of town that I come into from time to time. But for those of you, however small the number may be, that do not vote, that are listening to this and saying, "Look, I just want to be equipped because everybody just seems so stinking pissed off around all of these topics and all of this stuff. I just want to know how to talk to people about these things. I'm not necessarily interested in voting." To you, I say, friend, go in peace. It is not a mandatory ethic of your Christian faith to have to vote. But for those that choose to, for those that choose to play here, that's where I think we've got to boil it down to a reductionist level before we go any further.
Well, and that's actually where we were going with why I started with Philippians 2 in this case, because I think when we get into the policy discussion, that the best way actually to boil down what does it mean to love God and love others is actually best seen in the entirety of Philippians 2 and how Paul describes the attitude of Jesus more than just even the Luke 10 model of, well, who is my neighbor? Well, everybody is our neighbor. Because what we have in Philippians 2 encompasses even the idea of, well, what if I feel like voting is not going to be able to help me love my neighbor? Because if that is the case, and your reason for doing it is because of the fact that you are wanting to be able to love your neighbor more effectively, which I just had this discussion with somebody the other day where I was having to jump in and defend them as they were saying, look, I don't think I can vote anymore and still hold a Christian conscience that I'm loving God and loving my neighbor. I'm not able to do that in a voting booth anymore because of the way things are set up. To which the reasoning he did it was because of the fact that he could no longer see even and he did clarify later, and we'll clarify part of what we're getting to with all of this anyway. But on a grand state national scale, voting was not going to benefit anybody except for the government or himself, which is not helpful. And so this is why I say we need to start in Philippians 2 to actually understand what we mean when we say loving God and loving our neighbor. Because Paul continues on as he gives us a hymn, and he says, so put on the attitude of Christ Jesus, who, being in the nature of God, humbled himself, came to earth, and sacrificed himself for a people that did not know him, a people that did not recognize him, a people that did not even want to hear him talk. He humbles himself and sacrifices, and because of this, he now sits at the right hand of the Father. Yeah. And so the attitude of Jesus is, we love God enough that we are going to take on the same attitude that God has given and shown us, and that we are going to love people, putting them first, regardless of how that actually comes back and benefits us.
Yeah.
And that takes away the possibility for us to be able to say that loving our neighbors always is going to be in the best interest in terms of political interests or social interests or popularity or whatever. The best interest of us as individuals is not even something that needs to be considered as we go into this discussion if we're going to talk about loving God and loving our neighbors.
There's something that needs to be talked about, because if we're demystifying this, then we have to go the extra mile and say, when you are working your way through the math problem, right, and you get to your answer, well, your answer may be different than somebody else's answer. If
Yes.
you get to the answer, that is your own answer that you specifically have reached. Now, I'm going to take the conversation with the person that you, because it's applicable for a conversation that I had with my wife that just the other day, that the person you were talking to reached this point of, I'm looking at the big picture, I'm looking at the sum total thing, and I'm seeing that at this point in time, it is not beneficial to my neighbor for me to vote. That in the current climate, in the current situation and setup, it does not move the ball forward for others at all for me to engage with the voting procedure. My wife and I were having conversations because I was just being brought into this world and all of that. There are just some things that I've heard that I was like, hey, I think you should be aware of these things and all of that. And we were talking about what that looks like for, is this something that we feel like engaging with giving our voice to the voting process? What will that bear any benefit for anybody? Is it something that we feel like we need to be compelled to get engaged with and all of that? And y'all, there was no heresy to be found, and we put those those pegs in two different places. We did not agree on that, and that's okay. That is fine. That is a personal choice. And so if you notice a theme here, what we are talking about is personal perspective on the voting process, guided by the truth of Scripture, guided by the what it means to be a Christian and walk as a kingdom citizen and all of that. But as we continue on through the conversation, you're going to notice that these topics are not one size fits all, and we need to make sure not to say, "Oh, I hit this conclusion here. I came to this point." Well, that means that that's the right answer, right? That just means that's your answer.
Well, I'm gonna tweak that a little bit and say that there is one part of this that is a one size fits all for Christians, but it's not the one size fits all that normally gets thrown onto this. Mm-hmm. Because the one size fits all is that when we arrive at the place that Joe just talked about, where he and his wife, we're going to make it more generalized though, he and another believer with the same spirit in them and the same call to the world came to different points having this discussion. But part of why we know that that's okay is that both of them have the same goal in mind. Mm-hmm. The goal for both of them is still, how can I best love God while loving my neighbor? Mm-hmm. And so even if they disagree, the goal stays the same. even when we have disagreements, our goals stay the same, which again is part of where we get into some of the trouble with how we even address politics as Christianity, at least within most Western. This is not a particularly American thing. This goes back to Rome. This goes back to the UK. This goes back into all the different colonizations and Christendoms and everything else. The way we have talked about it is off because our goal is off.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to start us out here. Before we even get to the second part of the policy discussion, we need to actually look at what this actually means, because now we're actually back to somewhat of Pauline theology, but we're also going back to the Old Testament as well. So two passages, both of which get misused all the time. The first one is Jeremiah 29. There's specifically one verse in there that gets misused, which is what, Joe?
Hey, I'm pulling up Jeremiah 29. I'm not a repository,
he doesn't
man.
Remember it.
I don't remember
Jeremiah 29:11. Well, the funny thing is the way you just said it, because Jeremiah 29:11 is, "For I know the plans I have for you," right?
Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope.
Which everybody wants, is like one of the most common graduation verses out there. It changes a little bit when you actually read the entire letter. So Jeremiah 29 specifically is a letter to the exiles, the first round of exiles that were taken to Babylon. So this would actually be a letter that was sent out that Daniel and his friends got. This is part of the fun part when you get into the Daniel study and things like that, is that when you read Daniel in line with Jeremiah, things line up real fun. But what goes on in Jeremiah 29 is not a call for be glad you just graduated because look what God's going to do for you. Yeah. Instead, it is a call on how the people are supposed to still live godly lives in the midst of a pagan society that rules over them.
Yeah.
Jeremiah 29:7 is the verse I wish more people were quoting instead of verse 11, because Jeremiah 29:7 says, "Seek the welfare of the city that I brought you to." That is something that I think we need to take into consideration more when we get into these discussions about policies and things like that than any of the other things that we like to throw out there. Jeremiah 29 as a whole, for those that don't know, a lot of prophets had been prophesying that nothing was going to happen to Judah, that God was not going to abandon Jerusalem because of David. And so who cares what Babylon is doing? Who cares what Assyria is doing? God's got this. It's all good. Which on the surface sounds like a loving God type of prophecy. But the problem was that was not the prophecy God had given. The prophecy God had given, going all the way back through into Micah and Isaiah, like we talked about with and Joel, like we talked about with Nathan last week, was that there was desolation coming for Jerusalem. God could no longer turn away his eyes from the sins of Manasseh specifically. Babylon had already been decreed both in by Isaiah, both in terms of some of the other prophecies, as well as a direct prophecy to the king of Judah and Hezekiah. All of this was happening. The fact that people were saying, well, God won't do this, so we don't have to worry, was a problem. And so now that they are in exile, everybody's freaking out. What are we supposed to do? And so Jeremiah makes it very clear for them. 70 years has been decreed. So seek the prosperity of the city you're in. Build houses, build vineyards, get jobs, serve the king, marry off your kids. You can even marry them off within Babylon. It's all okay because this is what God has already declared. And so when we get to verse 11, Don't worry. God knows the plans he has for us. And it's for our good and not for our downfall. Because of what we see in verse 12 of that his people are going to call on his name again. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to worry. We don't have to be concerned. But the call to godly living in a pagan society in Jeremiah 29 is about loving their neighbors, specifically their pagan neighbors, the neighbors that were their oppressors and their conquerors. Now, we flip over to Paul in Romans 13, which is the other one that gets misused all the time, because Romans 13, Joe, we'll put you on the spot again. What is the big deal about Romans 13 as far as what always is talked about and always used? Romans 13 is about how Christians are supposed to live with who?
The government. So for most of you guys,
the government.
If you pull out your Bibles, and for as much as I have come to have a how do I say this, disdain for headers and for separations within the scripture, for most people, if you look at the header of this section, it's be subject to the government,
which is interesting. Because depending on what translation you have, changes what the header says for this chapter. And that's part of where the problems come in with how we actually go about dealing with Romans 13, which is why I always start with Jeremiah 29. Anytime I have been asked to teach government in a Christian setting, whether that's a school or a church, the way I start is always in this manner. We start in Jeremiah 29. Sometimes we go back a little bit further and we start in Daniel 5 and then go to Jeremiah 29. But we start in Jeremiah 29 and then go to Romans 13, because sometimes it's submit to the governing authorities is what the header is. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's Christian duties to the state, which is the one that I currently have up as what it's listed as. Some of them, though, is talking, there's no header here for 13, which I think is actually better, because at the end of chapter 12, what we have is Paul talking about how we are supposed to live ethically.
Yeah.
Let love be without hypocrisy. Right. Love one another as brothers and sisters. Outdo each other in showing honor. Don't lack diligence. Be fervent in prayer. Be patient in affliction. Rejoice in hope. We know these sort of things. This is also where, again, Paul goes into the same thing. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing so, you'll be heaping fire and coals on his head. And then the last verse of chapter 12 is, do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. And then let everyone submit to the governing authorities. That changes things a little bit when we actually are reading it in the context of what Paul just started in chapter 12.
Yeah.
And especially if we read it in light of Jeremiah 29. Mm-hmm. Romans 13 is not about the government at all. Romans 13 is about the church living in a world that is conquered by a pagan authority. Right. Just like Jeremiah 29 was for the exiles.
Right.
That changes a lot about our idea of what it means to be a Christian in America.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't matter at that point whether or not it's the Republicans or the Democrats or a theonomist or a Whig or a Green Party or even good old Vermin Supreme that is sitting in the Oval Office. Our responsibility does not change based off of who is in office.
Right. And that is part of why it's so important to when we approach these topics and we come forward and say, well, this is what Paul was saying. Well, rewind it back and be sure of what you're saying, because you've got to take a couple of steps backwards, and generally it's not many steps before you either are proving that you understand what you are reading, because sometimes that's the deal, right? We unfortunately have to talk about the situations where there's a fundamental misunderstanding, but that you may do your due diligence and say, oh, okay, cool, I'm dialed in, I got this, I understand what I'm reading, and fantastic if that's the deal. But you will also quickly come to understand if there's a misconception, and are you humble and submitted to the lordship of Christ to be able to say, I was not dialed in, I did not have the temperature on the room as far as this one goes. Because oftentimes, if you are unaware, Romans 13 is generally the origin point that says, oh, you don't want to fear cops? Don't do anything wrong. You don't want to have a problem with the government? Don't do anything wrong. And it's just that simple. When you actually investigate this, the situation of, okay, rewind it back in the beginning, how was it intended? What happened from that point? How did man separate its will from God's will? And then we go forward to the New Testament. What was this Jesus cat saying? And what was the point of him coming on the scene and saying what he said and doing what he did? And how does that interact with the Old Testament? Because if as Christians, I as somebody who is literally writing the curriculum for a group of people who, of all kinds of ages, on teaching them how to read their Bible, I can tell you it is not, yes, it takes work to come to an understanding of the canon of Scripture and how it all fits together. And that's okay. You don't need to all have it all figured out lickety split and immediately. But there is a responsibility on believers to look at the full picture and to figure out what was the intention for all of this, and what is Paul calling us to, and how does that relate at this moment in our history. And that's where this is one of those points right here, guys, that we need to let one very, very specific idol die. And that is that a specific perspective is the Christian perspective. A certain lean is the Christian lean. A certain person is God's ordained person, or something along those lines. Any flavor or any, however you want to state the statement, it's the idea that you are saying that one aspect of this is God's ordained path. And we go back to, are we looking at this through the lens of superiority, or are we looking at this through the lens of Christ and how we are taught to look at that's why it becomes so complicated. If any one of you guys listening, if anybody listening hears this and they're like, oh yeah, but what about, and what about, and what about? And so many of you guys could come forward and say, here is this incredibly complicated scenario. What about this? And you know what? There's probably so much legitimacy to you guys listening that are going through and trying to pray through and trying to have an honest desire to engage with the process, engage with the policies, and vote. And you really feel like you are compelled, but you don't know which way is the Christian way to view it. Where that pin goes is different than what the specific policy is. It's at a different point that, if we put it there, is a lot clearer and will help guide the path to what is the right way to vote in your situation, in your circumstance.
And that's where we get into part of why it's more timely for us to do this now than when we initially intended on recording this. Because the we see the results of what the idea that one policy is the Christian way to go and the other is not lead to, especially when it is not actually thought out. It's been, if it wasn't for the fact that I know what the consequences of this are, it would almost be amusing to see the reactions from people right now with the recent shift in the and I'm using shift in terms of the word that the media is using here, and we'll get to why it's not a shift in a minute, but the shift within the Republican National Committee's policy and plan moving forward that no longer is looking for the complete annihilation of abortion. That is no longer on the table. People are freaking out. And I've even seen some people make the question, well, what have we been trusting in this whole time? Which I think out of all the reactions may be the most honest, vulnerable response that I've seen.
Yeah.
Because this is part of the reality of what it is that some of us have been saying this for a long time. Some have just more recently come around to it, but they still are saying it the right thing, of the fact that when you have made conservatism your idol, that is exactly what you are doing, is you are making it an idol.
Yep.
And when that idol suddenly shows itself to be a false idol, hopelessness is what sets in.
Right.
And if hopelessness is what sets in, well, we already know what that actually means, that you've actually put your faith and your trust in. Because hope is one of the things that's listed in 1 Corinthians 13 as something that does not fade away.
Right.
And if something can be faded away as quickly as one press conference, we can be pretty sure that it was not a biblical worldview that you were holding on to,
right,
that got you to that point. Some of us also, though, are going to, and this is why I said shift is just a general term that is being used right now, is this is also part of the reason why we always hype so hard on understanding the theological history of a lot of these positions that Christianity has historically held. Because the reality is, Christianity has not historically held many of these positions. This is the Cold War theology stuff.
Right.
Because the reality is that the abortion platform didn't even exist until 40, 50 years ago.
Yep.
It's not a shifting that we see within Republican policy. It's that the need for evangelicals to side with them has shifted to the point where they don't feel like they need that anymore, because, and this is the thing that we as Christians have to recognize, is that the political parties now think that they have completely wrapped up the religious vote already, just based off the cult of personality that they have seen over the past 15, 20 years.
Yep.
That is part of why the voting conversation actually matters in terms of what it means to be a Christian in America today. Not because our votes really make that much of a difference on a national scale. If we believe Daniel 4 and Daniel 5, guess what? We actually believe that our votes don't actually matter when it comes to who we're electing as president.
Yep.
Because what does Daniel 4 and 5 talk about is that God is the one that sets up the times and the places and the kingdoms, not us. That's why Paul is able to say what he says in Romans 13 as far as submitting to governing authorities, because God is the one that gives them their authority in the first place. Even the pagan kings that we don't agree with.
Yep.
God is the one that sets them up for a time and a place and a season. And God will deal with their decision-making himself.
Yeah. And for all of our friends in the viewing audience right now whose ears just perked up and being like, they're finally giving credence to predeterminism. No, friends, that's not what we're talking about. What this is the age-old concept of what is your hope and faith in. That at a world level, one thing is happening, But regardless of the chaos and the nonsense and the circumstances and the situations and the political parties and the strife and all of it, that we can put our hope and our faith in something outside of that. That is the big picture. It's not about trying to step to scripture to prove one stance or another. It's about saying, hey, okay, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, but you got something deeper to be able to look at, to be able to put your faith into, to be able to hang your hat on.
And that actually is what the message of Daniel 4 actually is.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll test you one more time. Do you know which story it is? You don't have to give me the story. Do you know what story it is? Oh, he's looking it up already.
I don't.
So Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 3 is the one everybody's familiar with. It's the fiery furnace, right?
Yep.
Daniel chapter 4, we have Nebuchadnezzar writing this letter to the people, talking about his experience with God specifically.
Right.
Nebuchadnezzar has built the great city. He has built one of the 7 wonders of the world with the Hanging Gardens. He's done all of this stuff, and he has another dream.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel comes and interprets it for him and tells him, look, King, you're good. You're doing good, but you're getting a little bit in your own head. You need to humble yourself, or God is going to rip this away from you until you get it right.
Right.
He doesn't listen. A year to the day, he makes a very blasphemous statement of, look at what everything I have done. And he does it in a way that puts himself in a position of deification.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately, everything goes away. He goes nuts. He is living in the wilderness for a time, and he's eating bugs. His hair grows long. His nails grow long, all this other stuff. And then at the end of the appointed time, Nebuchadnezzar drops to his knees and declares God to be the only one with authority and the one that has done everything himself.
Right.
And when that happens, Nebuchadnezzar is restored. Not for long, because he's getting old, but he's restored. The point of the whole thing was recognizing that what we are actually talking about is not a determinism. It's a recognition of who actually holds all authority.
Mm-hmm.
God is the one that holds all authority. That is the crux of what Nebuchadnezzar's statement was. All authority, all glory, all honor belongs to God. He just happened to give me some for a time. That's a different statement than, well, it doesn't matter because God already planned it out and it's all just a big chess game. That takes all responsibility away from us, which is part of the second part of my statement in terms of the voting thing as far as our votes don't matter. The reality is, in many ways, our votes still do matter because we are going to still be held accountable to God for the things that we are backing. And now we're back into why loving God and loving neighbor actually matter in the midst of all of this. Are we only backing things that benefit us even to the detriment of other people? Because if that's the case, God's going to have something to say about that. Are we only backing things that look to be helpful to other people, but we've not actually looked at what it is actually doing to people?
Mm-hmm.
We are going to be held accountable for that. This is why it's important for us to be both knowledgeable in terms of our theology as far as what it actually means to love other people and what it means to love God. But it's also why we do actually need to be aware of what it is that we actually are voting for and what it is actually intended to do within our communities.
One thing that tickled my ears, and I know a subsect of people who are listening, it will probably tickle their ears because it's something that in a different context, in a different way, has likely been used as a weapon against them. So, one of the wonderful roles that I get to play in our network, I do it with Andrew, I do it with Ant, I do it with T, I do it with everybody that we do work with. I get to poke and I get to, but I also get to say, hey, I know these men's hearts. I do. So don't hear what they're not saying. Okay. In that whole thing of why our votes matter, will be held accountable, all of that sort of stuff, that is not a superseding edict to say ignore all of that first part of what we talked about, of where is your conviction at, of whether or not you feel like there is benefit to other people with how you vote. It's not what Andrew is not saying is you will be held accountable if you do nothing. So if you are somebody who looks at the landscape, looks at the whole thing, and is like, you know what, not my bag. The same my party. I'm just gonna go. Like, and I don't mean one side or the other. I mean like the whole thing. I'm just not gonna get involved. Okay, again, go in peace. Like that's fine. Like, and I know that because I know how willing I am to elect not to vote. And I know how often Christians who are who elect not to vote are ostracized or told that they're sinful or told that they're giving in to pagan authorities and all of this sort of stuff. And like, oh, God's gonna judge you for not having a say in doing the good Christian thing and voting and all of that sort of stuff. That is not what Andrew is saying. So do not soundbite that portion of it and think that then.
Well, and actually, I'm okay if they do soundbite, because what actually I said is actually nothing different than what everybody has talked about if they've ever been to Sunday school. The idea that our decisions is what God is holding us to is basic Christian theology, right? And in addition to that, not voting, I argue, and I've argued this for years, not voting is actually a form of participating in the democratic process as citizens. Saying that my support, you have not earned my support, is an important piece of the puzzle. I mean, that's the reason why boycotts happen. That's the reason why, part of the entire crux of the civil rights movement started on boycotts, because they had not earned the support. And so we are going to take all support away. We're not going to support your competitors. We're not going to support you. The entire system is not worth our support. And so we are not going to take part. Right. That is a valid form of democratic voting, even when a two-party system will tell you that it's not.
Yeah, the nuances that you're already adding to the conversation were more than what was there initially, and people. Right. While I know your heart. Your audience likely knows the core nucleus of your audience likely knows your heart. But when we put these things out and we throw them out there for anybody and everybody to listen to, without any restraint or sometimes any context, sometimes, especially when it's something as emotionally driven as politics, we can find ourselves in a situation where we say this one little piece over here and it becomes malformed and manipulated and used as some kind of leg to stand on to say, oh, he's just saying that you've got to get out there and vote. He's just saying that this is the only way to do it and all of that sort of stuff. And so for anybody who's listening to this, because things on voting, things on politics, these kinds of conversations are only going to continue to get more fervent and more relevant and more applicable, and trends and searches and all of those things are going to ramp up over the next couple of months. And so if you happen to hear this without any context for things like what the Ministry Misfits stand for, what our network stands for, what we mean when we say hashtag put Bluebeard on the logo,
that is the only vote that Bluebeard actually cares about, is that you vote to get his face on there, which there's been a couple of hashtags of that floating around. I don't know if I told you that or not, but there are people on your side at least.
Yeah. So if you are here with none of that context, then you are the person that I happen to be speaking about, because there's a lot of ground to cover with Cold War theology, about Imago Dei, about living in light of the kingdom, and all of these different moving pieces that are separate conversations that do inform this conversation, that give a better, well-rounded idea about the theological and sociological frameworks that we approach these things from.
And the key word I think that you said there is the emotional side of it. Because that's part of the problem with this discussion, why you and I even had to have it, is that politics automatically go emotional. They just do. But part of what we are saying, and this would be the too long didn't listen type of summary of this, is that the responsibility for us as a church is not to be emotional, but to be Christocentric. Which means that for some people in certain contexts, not voting is the right decision. For some people in certain contexts, voting one way is a certain is the right decision, while voting the other way may be the right decision for other people. But the reality is that if we as a church are still moving forward with the idea of the fact that Christ is at the center, and we are even moving forward with the idea that Christ is on his throne, then we are going to be able to do it in a way that we can have disagreement about politics without declaring our brother a heretic. We can have disagreements about politics and policies and still be able to say that you and I are still going to be able to go out and love our neighbor by doing this.
Right.
Because it's not about the emotional tie or even the political ties. It's about the fact that we as a church are still called to go and make disciples, love our neighbors, love those that will call us enemies, even in the political spectrum. And we are to go out and do what Christ did, which is to consider the needs of others as greater than our own. That is what the call of the church is.
Yes, and that doesn't change on topic or situation or circumstance or period of time or period in history. Let me give a for instance that also wraps in a different and very important topic when talking about voting. And if you are somebody who is listening to this and is wrapping your mind around this idea that two people can put their peg in two different spots and nobody is being blasphemous or heretical or anything else like that, and y'all can still do life together. Let me give you a for instance. I will put over Andrew for being one of the preeminent voices in my life over the last couple of years, walking with me through a new chapter of pastoral ministry, a new chapter of entering into different realms of conversation, and helping me to be able to wrap my mind around pastoral ministry at the world in the world at large. And this is that in so many ways, Andrew has been a shepherd to shepherds and continues to be a shepherd to shepherds. And over the last couple of years, sometimes it's been just he and I. We've had others come alongside us for a time. and sometimes you're walking together for a time and you just end up going your own separate ways, and all of that like Frank Sinatra said, that's life. We don't agree on the on some of the idiosyncrasies of voting. We have had long conversations about our disagreements because I am raging independent and rage against the machine and anti-establishment in a lot of ways, and am less willing to be. I have a harder time being charitable to the power systems than Andrew is. Not like in a way where he's gonna start drinking the Kool-Aid, but he understands the game and being a part of the game while not sacrificing your what makes you a Christian, and the edict and the call and all of that sort of stuff. And there has been animated conversations over the years, and we have revisited this, and we've had different conversations, and we've kicked the can around. But as I sit here, all of the jokes aside about joining Misfits and put my face on the logo and all of that sort of stuff, Andrew and I are partners in ministry in so many ways for the network. Andrew is the guy that I look to for guidance and for help and for prayer and all of that sort of stuff. And he has been such an informational and informative and somebody who's come alongside me to help shape me. And none of that required us being on the same page. And I'm not just talking about small things, because if you listen to us for the hour plus that we're on the air together, it sounds like we vibe on just about everything. And on a lot of the major notes, we vibe on a lot of those things. But understand that everything that you are hearing also comes with the giant asterisk that exactly where we put the peg on these separate things are not the same in large ways.
And if anybody's interested in how this conversation goes, typically if we reach an impasse, we just see who can come up with the better GIF response.
That's it.
But that literally is it. And if you think that we're joking, just ask Ant, and he'll very clearly tell you how much that is unfortunately true for him. Now, and the bigger thing though with all of it is that the major thing that we vibe on, and this is again the ultimate piece of this, is that we are both in agreement as far as who Jesus is and what that means for us.
Right. Exactly.
That's it. We don't have to agree on anything else. And that is ultimately where we've got to get back to church culture wise when we have these kind of discussions, especially as we lead up to another election, which, and again, this is where I wish I hadn't I told you so sure, even though that would come across way worse than I mean it. But this coming election, just like we had 4 years ago, and even 4 years prior to it, is one that is much more of a, I don't know if test is the right word, but a thermometer maybe of where the church, American church as a whole, not just evangelicalism, we are talking the church as a whole.
Yep.
What we actually believe about that statement that I just said as far as where Joe and I sit.
Yep.
This happened in 2016. It happened in 2020. It'll happen in 2024. And it is continually amping up the intensity level and frequency, which is why post 2020, suddenly Christian nationalism gained a real stage.
Yep.
And which is why in 2024, Project 2025 is suddenly now being spoken about by presidential candidates.
Yep, which is not a brand new concept for anybody who did not know that. It's not like that concept just hit. I've been hearing about that for years at this point.
And this is something, again, that some of us, Joel Bowman and I both are able to actually place an exact date of when both of us had said this is what the end result is going to be if the church does not do something now. Yeah. And when we say that, we are saying that in a way of what we have been talking about this whole time, not in terms of, well, if a certain candidate gets elected, then that's the end of Christianity as we know it.
Yeah.
God is still the one that appoints kings and kingdoms and places and times and seasons. What we are talking about, though, is that what we are putting Jesus's name on is what is at stake here. Because unfortunately, what we are seeing is people not doing what we have talked about this whole hour and 15 minutes. They are putting Jesus's name on a candidate rather than putting Jesus's name on the attitude that we are called to take, which again is why I led with Philippians 2 of a church that is fully committed to seeking the interests of others, to, as Jeremiah put it, seeking the prosperity of the city we are in, as Paul put it, of submitting to the governing authorities as part of our Christian ethic to love one another better, and to love without hypocrisy, and to love without quarreling and dissent and everything else. That is what we should be putting Jesus's name on during these political seasons. Not putting them onto policies and candidates and parties and governments and flags and anthems and allegiances and everything else. That is what we are actually talking about. Yeah.
And putting putting the perspective in the right place where it's no longer your responsibility to attack some side, to attack whatever side is not your side, because I watch it literally all the time where somebody posts something on social, all worked up, all fired up about the right, all fired up about the left, all fired up, and then somebody calls them out in the comment section. They're like, well, actually, what I meant was, well, that's not what the original statement was. The original statement was full of piss and vinegar about a specific perspective, about attacking a specific thing. And when we put our perspective in the right place, yes, everything that Andrew said, yes and amen to all of that. But also the thing that you're going to find is that your love of others, your love of neighbor will be a lot more intact than if you are swayed by the whims of this stance or that stance, or this group of people means this thing or that group of people. That's why I think there's a lot of people in our space who are talking about the political stuff that I think they get part of it right, but it's still so driven by a specific bias. And don't get me wrong, y'all, I have my opinion. America it's forced the hand. It's forced the hand. We look at the landscape, guys. Look at the landscape. It has shown what the American church values most out of politics at a large scale. You can't negotiate your way around that. But that's not dependent on a stance, or that's not dependent on a perspective or a side or whatever. I mean that as a whole. And so it's not that I don't have opinions. It's that if we keep theology prime as our driving force, Christ and him crucified, the close-handed matters of the Christian faith as the most important aspect, of our perspective and what drives how we interact with the world around us, how we interact with people, what we choose to let us get all worked up, what we get anxious about, what we get fearful about, what we think is the most important, then suddenly it's not that we no longer have a desire to get involved in the conversation, but we're also not cast to and fro by the whims of the situation. We can still love others. We can still do what we need to do as Christians and have an opinion and be able to vote and be able to say, this is what I think is best, without then suddenly going through and saying that the American flag and the Christian cross are on the same level.
And so that's if you want more context or content, either one, dealing with some of these sort of things. In the show notes, you'll find the link to the YouTube playlist that we jokingly titled the Murica playlist, but we decided it works, so we're keeping it. There's also playlists dealing just with political topics that aren't necessarily even related just to the U.S., just politics in general, things like that. Those are all going to be in the show notes as far as stuff like that. You also, if you go to the Misfits website under the resources tab and the Theology 101 tab, we deal with some of these stuff in writing form as well. I'm sure there will be more coming. If you have no idea what some of the terms that we use today we're talking about, specifically the 2020 Project 2025, either Google it or wait a couple weeks. Joe's going to be back. We're going to dive straight into that mess, which, is going to be much more of a, I wonder if anyone said that this was coming over the past decade. Oh, wait. Things like that where maybe just a little bit sarcastic, all that good stuff. It's coming. In the meantime, though, go if you want more on Acts in general, because we did spend a good amount of time there as well. Buddy Walk with Jesus podcast, YouTube, all the good stuff. The Acts project is going on. If you want more demystifying Kingdom on the Road, where we're demystifying the Old Testament. If you want more just straight up conversations of us, like what is wrong with people, why can't we get this right, Let It Rip on Saturday mornings 9:30 Eastern as well. You can get all that stuff. I'm in and out of those conversations depending on schedules. Joe is always on as the gracious host and the one that is able to get everybody riled up the easiest. So Joe, we will definitely have you back. You'll be back. In the meantime, again, buddywalkwithjesus.com or all the different social stuff. If you want more of the Daniel stuff, like we talked about, patreon.com/ministry misfits. We are eventually going to finish the book of Daniel once Tamiko and I schedule a line. But chapter 4 specifically, like we talked about, chapter 5 specifically, like we talked about, they are up and on there right now in the Bible study format, dealing with some of the stuff, not all of it.
One more thing.
What were we going to say, Joe?
If you guys are looking for a series addressing godly nations and what it means to have somebody acting in a power position faithfully and demystifying some of that stuff. Last year, we walked through Esther. And we did a series called For Such a Time as This. It was season 3 of Buddy Walk with Jesus. And that walked through what does it mean for God to be faithful? What does it mean for such a time as this? What does it mean for God to put something on a leader's heart and all of that sort of stuff? That whether you realize it or not, are notes that very, very often get pulled into this conversation when we start talking about God ordained leaders, or for a leader to be an appointed leader or anything like that. So that's all also there for you guys as a resource.
Yeah, and then even the series before that he did, walking through the book of Matthew, has some very applicable content related to kingdom and related to kingdoms of the world and things like that as well. So again, buddywalkwithjesus.com or Buddy Walk with Jesus on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts, all that good stuff. Some of it you can even find off the Misfits website, because I was a part of for such a time as this one with 3-4 episodes of it. So yeah, we will be back to deal with the Project 2025 here in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, we finally were able to sit down with Dr. Vicky Byler and talk through her book on how to do ministry to the disability community, both in the church and outside the church, and dealing with church hurt and dealing with all sorts of different stuff like that. So be on lookout for that. That may be next week, that may be the following week. We're not 100% sure yet, but it is coming. Joe will be back. We'll see if he did enough to get himself a spot on the logo, and we will see the rest of you next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.